of forces and the balance of interests is formed. It might be a polycentric world of a concept where balance and agreements is reigning. It might be a new multipolarity, but before we come up with that model, we'll see a lot of regional conflicts, controversies when the conflicts are used in order to inflict the damage to the other side. That's about proxy conflicts with the use of the third parties, and that's about hybrid conflicts, and we'll see lots of them in the upcoming decades, unfortunately. Thank you so much. And the last slide that I would like to... Since 2022 through 2026, and we took the data for 2022 from the stock markets 2 days ago. A dramatic rise in the capitalization of the American defense companies that are producing conventional weapons. And Palantir made a real breakthrough. Its capitalization grew 24 times over that period of time. And sadly, Rheinmetall was a big success. Its capitalization increased more than 15 times. In 2022, Rheinmetall or Palantir were not noticeable at the stock market. And that's a kind of a political economic dependence. It all starts with an escalation and aggressive propaganda. Then political relations worsen. Then we see the rise in the defense spending, and the capitalization of defense companies is growing. That's a classical corporate tendency of the 21st century. And that's not about asking a question, but this is a fact of the stock markets. I do think that this data would be very useful for all the participants of the Primakov readings, for that panel, and for the subsequent discussions. And now I pass the floor to our panelists for their statements, for their pitches that they want to share with us. Alexander Grishka, over to you. Thank you so much. I will try to adjust my presentation with a view of what's been said by Konstantin Kosachev, Yurushakov, and you. Let me start with saying that you set the right direction for our discussions for that panel. Global ramifications conflicts. And it may explain what is going on not only in the world, but already emerged from the egg of a unipolar world and claims its own interests and is impacting the global agenda. And we cannot squeeze the multiple world back to the framework of the previous world order. We see that the West doesn't want to make up with that in order to maintain its dominance that helped the West to pump up the natural resources, and they're using All the illegal documents, including the psychological pressure and cyber warfare, also they escalating the regional conflicts that have global ramifications. If we look at the panoply of those conflicts through that prism, we can state that such a military competition, the competition for the dominance, alarming is not only the situation in the Middle East, but also in the Eurasian space, where the West tries to address its geopolitical objectives, such as like in Europe, introducing the bloc-based ideology, and proceeding from the latest developments in Venezuela and Cuba. The atmosphere of fear is instilled, and aggression against Iran follows the same rationale. All that goes on against the backdrop of dismantling of the system of the international law, the international security system. We see the rise in the defense spending, the decay and decline of confidence and trust in the international affairs, and that decreases the chances for a peaceful settlement. And as President Putin has said, that's not a question whether the multipolar world has emerged, but we have to learn how to manage the multipolar world altogether. And the European continent is closer to my heart. Let me immediately tell you that the European and Euro-Atlantic security system that was based on equal and mutual respectful relations obviously no longer meets the geopolitical ambitions of the EU and NATO. The whole world, the West, actually perceives the world as the source of resources for themselves. The conflicts actually are brought not only to the remote regions, for instance, the Baltic region and the high seas and the Antarctic region, the regions where there were no natural reasons for conflicts. On the contrary, there was the need for a very broad international cooperation in the interests of security, peace, and flourishing. And the West has turned the West Balkans into the area of rivalry, as Federica Mogherini stated, being the head of the diplomatic corps of the European Union. If there is no European Union there, the Balkans would be seized by Russia and China.
Talking about Ukraine, it is obvious that amid the hybrid war hedged against Russia as a leader in global majority of the country, which acts internationally in the interest of this global majority, and paves the way to a new system of international relations. It's clear that amid this hybrid war, Ukraine is being used as the material to waste, as the battlefield to tame Russia, to make strategic defeat against Russia, even though they are not saying that. But if you look at all the activity of the EU and NATO, practical activities, practical steps, if you look at the strategic and doctrine-based statements which characterize Russia not as the direct but long-term threat, and some already insist that we need to be regarded as an existential threat. So this is a long-term strategy which goes beyond the horizon of hypothetical peace settlement in Ukraine. It's good to have this table, a couple of figures. Why is it happening so? As of today, so this is the data of the Institute of Strategic Research, the sum of military spendings, global military spendings, amounts to $2.63 trillion US dollars. This is a huge amount of money. So the amount of military spending by NATO countries is close to 53% of the global figure. If the norms of NATO are fulfilled, as 5% of GDP per military spending within next 5-7 years, the amount of military spendings by NATO countries will amount to 65% of the global figure. So 32 countries will account for 65% and two-thirds, and 131 country will account for 35%. The only figure demonstrates that we are talking about the confrontation between NATO and the whole world and the rest of the world, and the desire to get all the resources to manage all the processes. And we know that the West call adversaries those processes they do not manage. So this is the reality which will mostly determine the pace and the dynamism or the picture you've demonstrated. And you need to understand that military spendings are not just the money you can just send and get back. This is about the brainwashing, the strife for an adversary and for an enemy. And the Russia has been created as an adversary by NATO. Russia has never been a threat to either EU or NATO countries. It was just beyond any possible practical policy or practical feasibility, including military planning after the Cold War particularly. So this is the reality we face. Now let's talk about the EU. So the EU contribution to the global world economy went down from 21% when they reached the US and Chinese level, down to 14%. The share of EU in global military spending is 21%. If they go along the way to increase the amount of military spending according to NATO standards, so the amount of the EU military spendings will make up $1 trillion per year. This is just fantastic figure. And this is the reality we face. We do understand that all these military spendings will not only about the procurement and purchase of weapons and armory. So military spendings are mostly for getting new military capabilities and capacities. Why do Americans support this initiative? So the process of stronger Europe as a biggest amount will be spent on buying weapons and armory from the United States. European composition of this procurement is 64% purchases of weapons and arms from the United States. So it is associated with a campaign to brainwash. Demonization of Russia started long ago, probably somewhere back in 2012. Now we have 2026. Can you imagine that in the West there is a new generation which lives amid this white background sound, amid this propaganda where the central core element is Russia as an adversary? I'm not going to quote statements, political officials of the Western countries, but they cause a threat not because of their sanity, but because the circumstances under which the political decisions can be made, where and when this possible unforeseeable military confrontation can happen. So we are approaching this abyss, and the world is becoming more dangerous. I do understand that I'm going to be beyond timing I have been given. Just one more note I would like to draw your attention to. These are the figures. The resources spent on the international cooperation assistance to Ukraine by the OECD countries, including the nations of the EU in 2025, it was $43.9 billion, which is more for sub-Saharan African countries, which got $29 billion, 23% lower than year on year. If we look at the structure of spendings, the structure of these efforts undertaken, so they demonstrate the trend to distract these resources from the development goals and allocation of these resources to the confrontation purposes, to kill these new centers of powers. And the last point I'd like to mention, there haven't been research into how Europe had return on dividends of the pace, so there were experts and they calculated that number, that because of the detente and the end of the Cold War, giving up the heritage of the Cold War, the peaceful dividend for Europe amounted to 17 to 25 trillion US dollars. It is not real. I believe it is absolutely feasible figure if we just get back to 7 years ago when the European countries spent for defense purposes around 1.5% of their GDP and felt quite secure. Since there were other ways to provide the national security rather than supremacy over the Russian Federation, which will end up in nothing. But there is a question: which big resources have been wasted and which resources could have been used to utilize them for the development goals and to find the way out of the regional conflict, providing for the regional harmonic development, not only for the whole planet, but to create all the circumstances and the conditions for the good development of the region and for the emerging countries particularly. Thank you very much. So you've gone beyond timing because you are the only panelist who takes part in the strategic planning process. I couldn't interrupt you, Mr. Graham, please.
Being here. I don't want to use my remarks to focus on contemporary issues. I want to take some time to describe the challenges that the United States is facing as it rethinks its grand strategy in the evolving global context. My starting point is that the unipolar world of American dominance, preeminence, has ended irrevocably. The world has become much more complex. It's not truly multipolar at this point. Only the United States and China are truly global powers. But it is clear that power has become more diffused, and there are other centers of power that want to play large roles in the years ahead. Russia is certainly among them, and it will defend its role as a great power in the years ahead, no matter what the domestic problems might be at this point. India clearly has ambitions to expand its global sway in the years ahead. And Europe, for the first time, is beginning to develop its own geopolitical hard power capabilities, in part because it's no longer confident that the United States is going to be its ultimate security guarantor. Now, this global environment presents an unprecedented challenge for the United States. Never before has the United States dealt with a world of multiple powers from which it couldn't withdraw. Isolation is not an option at this point. Never before has the United States actively engaged in a global environment when it didn't believe it could dominate or hope to dominate that environment as it did during the Second World War or during the Cold War. And never before has the United States actively engaged in the world in a competition with powers that it can't hope to transform or decisively defeat. So this is the reality that the United States is going to have to deal with. I think we know that the United States must remain actively engaged in global affairs. The challenge domestically is to make it politically viable. And that means that the United States, the administration, has to reconcile active engagement in the world with American exceptionalism, that view that the United States is an exceptionally virtuous country on the global stage that rightly or wrongly still enjoys tremendous political sway in the United States. I think it's important to remember that it's because of American exceptionalism that the United States did not engage actively in a multipolar world when it emerged as a major power at the very end of the 19th century. The American public would not support engagement in balance of power politics because they thought it would sully the America's reputation, it would erode America's own democratic principles, and it would drag the United States into conflict that it did not want to engage in. Active engagement reconciled itself with American exceptionalism only when that multipolar world turned into a bipolar world at the very end of the Second World War. This was a time when the American public could believe that the United States was supporting the free world against a godless communist bloc. This appealed to the American sense of mission, that is, moral leadership in a struggle between freedom and dictatorship, and the way we talked about it, between good and evil. The unipolar moment that followed was clearly one when the United States could demonstrate moral leadership as it tried to spread its own values worldwide in the years after the end of the Cold War. But the question we face now is how can we reconcile American exceptionalism with active engagement in global affairs in a world that the United States can't dominate in competition with rivals that it cannot defeat? Now, the answer that I propose to this, and this gets to some of the questions of how we deal with global affairs, is what I call the grand strategy of competitive coexistence. This strategy is based, one, on the assumption that rivalry among great powers is a permanent feature of global affairs that needs to be carefully managed. Second, it recognizes that the destructive power of modern weaponry creates a situation in which it is a moral and strategic imperative to avoid great power war. Third, it acknowledges that there are a number of transnational challenges that require great power competition, and it's necessary to keep open the possibility of cooperation, even as countries compete actively on the global stage. And finally, competitive coexistence redefines American leadership on the global stage and charges it with forging the types of equilibria at the regional level, at the global level, that creates a situation in which the United States can flourish and which it can build what it would like to call its exceptional hill on the city that other countries would like to emulate. Now, broadly speaking, this does not have to be simply a grand strategy for the United States. It could be a strategy to regulate conflict more broadly if other countries were to accept it. At that level, I think we need to recognize that this system is not self-regulating. It would require constant tending, particularly by the major powers, to ensure that coalitions shift as necessary to deal with problems as they emerge. Stability is created when no great power thinks that it has no recourse but the use of force in order to defend its interests, and stability is created when no one power thinks that it can dominate all the others. So this is the challenge that we're all going to face in the years ahead. Three tasks, I think, that are important for this policy of competitive coexistence. First is that we all need to keep the system essentially multipolar. We need to be able to shift alliances as necessary, coalitions as necessary, to deal with changing circumstances as they arise. Earlier balance of power systems collapse either because we saw the emergence of a rising revolutionary aspiring hegemon. Napoleonic France is the case at the turn of the 19th century, or it collapsed because the multipolar system ossified into bipolar contest. That's what we saw at the very end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So we need to maintain the system as truly multipolar. Second, We need to de-emphasize the role of ideology and values in interstate relations. Now, it's clear that there's going to be competition over ideology and values. The United States, I can't imagine, is ever going to give up its belief that its values are universal. But we can't allow this clash of values to define the competition at the global stage, because that prevents the finding of pragmatic resolutions to the challenges we face going forward. Value clashes tend to be either or. What we need is competition that can be resolved more or less. And that is generally true of geopolitical competition. And the final task is to develop a code of conduct in the sense that legitimates this new order. Since competitive coexistence is managed competition, it is critical that all major powers exercise restraint. The goal in any contest should not be victory, but rather the slow accumulation of advantage over time, something that keeps all the players in the system. And finally, diplomacy should take precedence over the use of force. Now, this is my sort of proposal for the way we manage things going forward. This will be part of the debate in the United States, certainly in the next couple of years as we move towards our next presidential election. I certainly hope that competitive coexistence wins the struggle within the debate, because I'm advocating it, but it wouldn't be the first time I've lost if it didn't. Thank you.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you so much, Tom. You have developed the ideas that I read in your latest book about Russia, about the competitive coexistence, and you even progressed on that way. But how would you comment on the following? Donald Trump asked for a budget of about $1.5 trillion in the year 2026-2027. So the budget of $1.5 trillion, is it the GDP of the Netherlands or Indonesia? This is a little bit less than the GDP of Turkey. How can we make up with that figure? When I saw that figure quite a while ago, I thought the strategic planning in the United States actually is driven by the double deterrence of Russia and China. That's why they are asking for so much money. Probably this is not an easy question. Well, all the questions are not easy. I don't have any other questions. Once Henry Kissinger said, what I can say, that you could accept that positively here in Russia, and that would allow me to get back home.
There is again a major debate going on in the United States over how we need to structure our defenses. I think an argument can be made that we neglected some of what we needed to do in terms of modernizing our forces in past years. Part of this 1.5 trillion, if indeed it gets through Congress, is meant to bring our military capabilities back up to appropriate levels. There is an arms race going on. Russia participates in it, China participates in it. We see that at the nuclear level. Russia and China have modernized their nuclear forces in a way we haven't up to this point. A lot of the money would go to the modernization of that triad in order to maintain strategic stability. So I think that is what is driving the administration at this point. But there is going to be a major debate in the United States whether we need to spend that money and that at that level on defense going forward. There are clearly a host of domestic political issues, economic issues, social issues that have to be dealt with. So I don't believe that we will reach that level. It'll be something less, and much will turn on what happens in 2028, because this is not sustainable as a defense budget over the longer term.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. And Thomas Greminger, over to you. And Mr. Greminger is not the first timer for the Primakov ratings, and unlike most of the European experts, he's still not afraid of coming to Moscow, not afraid of coming back home.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and at the outset, thank you for inviting me to the Primakov readings. It's an honor to be here. Look, I would have made a few general remarks at the outset on the global repercussions of regional conflicts, on food security, energy security, on the global economy, on how violations of international law set precedents and undermine the international system, on the highest number of conflicts ever since the end of World War II, concluding that we are probably finding ourselves today in a security situation that has not been as dangerous since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we've covered these topics in our introductory conversation. So let me focus my 5 to 6 minutes, let me focus my pitch on Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security space and try to come up with an answer to your questions about the prospect for establishing a system of equitable and inclusive security in Eurasia. It has been my long-standing view that there are 3 interlinked conflicts that affect European security, 3 distinct conflicts that are ongoing simultaneously, one between Russia and Ukraine, one between Russia and Europe, and one between Russia and the United States. There is an American political scientist and diplomat, Michael Kimmich, that calls these 3 conflicts collisions. I like this image of collisions. Now it is clear that you cannot solve one collision without addressing the 2 others. There is not a pre-described sequence in addressing these collisions, but finding a fair end to the war in Ukraine with agreements on the principles of a settlement and on the modalities of a ceasefire seems to me a prerequisite for substantive progress on the 2 other collisions. There has been a very promising US facilitated effort, an effort that needs as soon as possible to be reinvigorated. We need again political momentum. We need a proper process design, and we need a solid negotiation architecture. Now, beyond ending hostilities in Ukraine, there are some obvious steps to reduce tensions between Russia and the West. Unfortunately, for many people, talking about the future of European security beyond ending hostilities in Ukraine is still a taboo. But we need to have this conversation. We need to figure out ways of managing relations between Russia and the West. The current trajectory is a very dangerous one for all sides. After all, there is a 5,000-kilometer long line of contact between Russia and the West that needs to be managed. Needs to be managed even if it's only to prevent inadvertent escalation. Therefore, there should be urgently a discussion of military risk reduction and security and confidence building measures relating to the air, to the sea, to the land, and also in cyberspace, and also taking account of new technologies and weapon systems. There should be a resumption of mill-to-mill dialogue. There should be a reinvigoration of crisis communication channels. There should be talks on how to prevent and respond to incidents and accidents, again, in the air, at sea, and on land. We just see too many close encounters these days. OEC states should review and modernize monitoring and verification commitments and procedures. And there should be, rather sooner than later, an exploration of arms control measures to slow down the dangerous arms race on the European continent. It is encouraging to hear now for some weeks, for a couple of months, senior European officials floating the idea of dialogue with Russia. At the same time, I guess we need more top officials in Russia to signal that they also want to talk. It is obvious that it will take time, probably a lot of time, to re-establish a meaningful dialogue after so many years of not talking to each other. As a former Secretary General of the OEC, I must admit that I think the OEC would still be a good place to have such a dialogue. Indeed, if there is to be inclusive security in Europe, Russia needs to be part of that security order. That said, Russia needs to make it clear that it wants to be part of a reformed European security structure and not just, pivot to Eurasia. To conclude, you don't need a crystal ball to see that deterrence and confrontation will be the prevailing philosophy and posture for the foreseeable future in European security. But that is all the more reason to keep open channels of dialogue, to promote restraint, and to establish guardrails to prevent us all from going over the edge. Thank you.
Mr. Greminger, thank you so much for your very frank presentations. And that I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Manjit Kripalani. She's from Mumbai, a brilliant city, city from the south.
Can you hear me? Terrific. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be here at the very prestigious Primakov conversations. I'm going to talk about the three conflicts that we have and our response to it. So there's Russia-Ukraine, of course, there's West Asia, and there is the US-China trade war. That is also a conflict. So the first two have affected all of us, particularly in terms of fuel, fertilizer, and food. We saw in the West Asia conflict a repeat of what happened in 2022 when the world almost came to a halt. We all adjusted and the countries managed, but the costs affected daily life and the impact on the global south has been severe. The US-China trade war has, on the other hand, made everybody think about the future, the cost of disconnecting from China dependence. Everybody is finding this extremely difficult, particularly in Europe, but it has, in the US, manifested into the artificial intelligence rush, and other nations are now coalescing around this new race. So far, the US is in the lead, and unlike the other wars, it's a little bit more positive because it looks to the future. So despite all these three wars, the world GDP was due to grow at 2.5% earlier this year. It is now just under 2%, and really it could be worse, so it's not. The regional conflicts have accelerated the discussions around three areas: narratives, connectivity, and innovation. I'll speak mostly about Russia and India. So Russia is actively creating an alternate sphere for narratives and for connectivity. For narratives, Russia today is a very solid counter to the Western narrative, and it's gaining popularity around the world. For connectivity, the international North-South transport corridor from St. Petersburg to Mumbai wasn't moving very fast. And it's been hanging fire from when it was first envisioned in year 2000, hanging fire for 25 years. But it is now being taken seriously, and Russia has certainly done its part. Russia's export to Iran via this corridor was up over 50% this year. India has been very slow to develop the Chabahar port, mostly because of US pressure. But if the West Asia war normalizes Iran's position in the region, this will accelerate. For Russia, innovation and defense has been intense, mostly due to the war, and outside of defense due to sanctions, particularly in fintech and new technologies. On the India side, for narratives, connectivity, and innovation, India is finally confidently developing its own narratives, and it's cleaning up the misinformation of the past, questioning Western dogmas and misleading narratives like democracy and freedom rankings, and really Indian society, which we no longer perceive ourselves as being poor. If you still see the pictures in the West, it is always a picture of a poor Indian, which represents 1.4 billion people, and this is not correct, because India itself has moved forward, lifted 270 million people out of poverty, 27 million people out of poverty, and in its own head, India is a middle-class country. Indian social media and private media channels are run by a new generation of non-colonial Indians, and they are doing the same as the Russians, correcting past narratives and creating new ones. India is also at the center of 3 major connectivity projects which are creating alternate routes and supply chains. First is IMEC, which is the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, created by the US and India and announced during India's G20 presidency in 2023. The second is the INSTC, which is the International North-South Transport Corridor, and the third is the Chennai-Vladivostok Corridor. So 2 of these are with Russia and 1 is with the US and Europe. These are all alternative routes to contain the impact of the disruption that we've seen from the Russia-Ukraine war and also the West Asia war just now. So work on the IMEC is now on in earnest, especially in India, which is the originator country. India's largest port is Vadhavan, it's outside of Mumbai, and work is on in full swing. So are the railway lines and the roads in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, no matter what we might say about the Gaza and Palestine issue. The INSTC will pick up if Iran is normalized, especially so India can work on developing this critical Chabahar port. And 3, the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor via the Pacific holds great promise, especially for India to get access to Russia's resources in the Far East. But unfortunately, it's been ignored until this week, when talk about its ability to reduce West Asia dependence has now surfaced. On innovation also, India has fallen behind. We can learn a lot from Russia. On technology, though India has world-class services companies, these same companies are clinging to their old models of 40 years, although they will be redundant by next year, 2027, given the immense importance and ubiquitous presence of artificial intelligence. Many call the US investment in AI a bubble, but even if it is, those who remember the tech bubble of 2000 will remember that it left behind infrastructure like optic fiber cables and cheap bandwidth and trained manpower that gave rise to Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Lastly, regional political groupings are accelerating, reluctantly or otherwise. They believe in international rules, they follow the rules, and they are now updating their own rules and connections. ASEAN has been buffeted by the US-China rivalry and now the West Asia war. Just last week on June 18th, ASEAN signed an energy cooperation agreement with Russia for conventional and emerging energy sources, including nuclear. They are also putting their students into training programs to understand these initiatives better. This is creative. New multilateral groupings like BRICS have gained salience in world affairs. During the West Asia war, even the West kept urging BRICS to bring the war to an end. It wasn't possible because BRICS has a group of rivals within that, and they could not agree to each other's demands, Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. However, it has forced BRICS to take itself more seriously. which it is starting to do. For instance, only last week, the BRICS Cultural Group met in India, where they agreed to team up in twos and support each other's nominations for UNESCO heritage status. These are all very promising and forward-looking movements.
Благодарю вас.
Thank you so much. Fyodor Wojtolowski, over to you. Thank you so much. When we are speaking about conflicts in the modern world and their global ramifications, we have to understand the root causes of those conflicts. And those root causes, in my opinion, lie in the fact that that struggle for leadership, for the leading positions in the nascent polycentric world, in the global hierarchy, now is in the full swing. And in the course of that struggle, the fight, the powers, the conglomerates of major companies that are associated with those companies, those countries, they try to get some space in that world to achieve the best positions, not only in the area of global politics, but in the area of technological competition, in the area of economic competition. And in that sense, the competitive coexistence model that was offered by Thomas Graham is just in the making. And that process would take time because the parties would test each other and looking for the limits of endurance. And we see that in the course of Russian-Ukrainian conflict. And certainly this is not a conflict merely between Russia and Ukraine. This is a conflict between Russia and the collective West. Ukraine is on the one hand a proxy that is being used by the West, but on the other hand, this is a site or a platform where that conflict develops. And in that conflict, and in the conflict between Israel and the United States against Iran, we see that the parties are trying to test each other for the limits of their endurance. They try not only to feel the weak points, but until what point they may undermine and to test the sustainability.
The asymmetric nature of this conflict is so that the attacking party sometimes is more vulnerable. If we're talking about what is the object of such tests, this is not only the economy of the state. And here we see that economic sanctions and constraints and limitations, pressure, different types of reciprocal economic weapons are expanding. So this is military security. But here everything is quite evident. It's clear that nuclear weapons in case of conflict in Ukraine is, and I hope it will be, the reliable tool of deterrence, which will not allow us to move to the direct confrontation. We have seen numerously the attempts of these warming narratives about possible international troops, the coalition of the willing to enter the territory of Ukraine. That would mean the direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. With the ramifications difficult to forecast, Russia warned about the risks associated with such a move. Everybody understands, and the parties show their unwillingness to do that, regardless of the attempts to escalate, that the direct confrontation between Russia and NATO will lead to the nuclear strikes on both sides. But using proxy fight in a hybrid format and the use of weapons in the gray zone will expand. We do understand that the confrontation in the gray area, when it does not quite clear which is the source of the activity, opens a lot of opportunities. These are the attacks against critical infrastructure facilities, against energy infrastructure facilities. So that started with the attack against the pipeline, Nord Stream 2. After that, we have seen abundance of examples when a third party, or quite exact party, undertook such attacks. I'd like to draw attention to the symmetry of the actions. Last year, Ukrainian energy system could stop existing. The only core were the Russian, Soviet nuclear power plants. Russia didn't undermine the security and safety of nuclear facilities, understanding the ramifications not only for Ukraine, not for the neighboring countries, but for the global security in general. But we witness numerous attacks of the Ukrainian military forces against the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is under control of the Russian Federation. Mr. Likhachov, the head of Rosatom, have drawn our attention to this fact numerously. Pipelines, energy infrastructure. Right now we see massive attacks against Russian energy infrastructure facilities, which, according to the opinion of Kiev and those who support this regime, should escalate this conflict to a new level and put another pressure on Russia. But I'm absolutely positive that it will lead only to retaliation measures, to reciprocal measures, because this is a full ignorance of the Russian character. We've seen in the course of the conflict between the United States and Iran, we've seen possible risks for critical infrastructure. Iran only hinted at possible strikes against subsurface deep water cables in the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran had used the weapons in earnest to undermine these cables, so the damage to the world economy would have been much bigger, comparable with those which happened when the Strait of Hormuz was closed. The same related to the banking services of these Gulf countries and data centers. So the attacks against data centers potentially lead to serious risks, and that became a new tool of confrontation, and the countries can demonstrate to each other these capabilities. Corporate sector. See the expansion of the participation in these global conflicts, and we'll see more and more examples when the state delegates to the enterprises, to corporations, not only the power functions. Everybody knows the private military companies phenomenon, but they will delegate function of participating in infrastructure provision to dominating military field. So everybody knows Starlink. This is the case when American company, independent of the state, allegedly, but working on state orders with serious investment from the state, actually conducts the support of Ukrainian military forces in the military conflict, and at the same time cut off the services used by the Russian party. And we witness how companies can be subjected to the states, but there are some cases when the companies do not follow the state orders. We see the precedents, unfortunately, when the companies from friendly countries can supply electronics and electronics infrastructure for producing UAVs and drones to Ukraine, even though these are friendly countries to Russia, and the government cannot do anything about that. The same is true on both sides, but this is the example how companies can act beyond the state will. We are to live in this world within the next decade. I'm more optimistic, and I do believe that major powers will be able to agree on a new level playing field, on a new code of conduct, and to work out the model of this competitive coexistence. But particularly right now, in the course of the conflict in Ukraine and in the course of the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran, we see the shaping of these new global rules for the global order. Thank you very much, Fedor. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A from our audience. And let me ask the first question. Professor Wojciechowski elaborated at the end of his presentation on new rules. At what was mentioned by Professor Thomas Graham, the code of conduct. Have a question to both Fedor and Thomas. How do you believe who is going to work out these rules? In non-published part of the Strategy of National Security by the United States, which was unveiled because it was leaked to the mass media, it stipulated 5 powers: the United States, Russia, China, India, and Japan. There was no single European country. But this is one of the approach to the weapon which is not quite successful, but it shows the process when it comes to the strategic planning in Washington. Thomas and Fedor, who could undertake this huge role to work out new rules or new code of conduct?
First, there's a role for the expert community to think through clearly what a new set of rules might be that could be accepted by the major powers on the global stage. Some innovative thinking about how to organize this. But at the end of the day, if you're going to have a code of conduct, it's going to have to be negotiated among the major powers. So we get back to something that Thomas Greminger talked about. There's a real need for dialogue to focus on how countries are going to manage the competition responsibly. I think all major powers, particularly the nuclear powers, have a strategic and moral responsibility to prevent great power war that almost certainly would escalate to the nuclear level. So if I were running policy at this point, which I'm not, I would ask the expert community to begin to think through, bring together the Russian experts, the Indian experts, the Europeans, the Chinese, and the Americans, and they begin to think through how we want to manage this conflict. How do we build trust among the various sides? How do we put in place the proper verification measures? And at the same time, I would begin to open up the dialogue at the official level. I think we can get much more done at the expert level at this point, given the lack of contact and the lack of trust at the official levels. But again, it's going to be the experts and the officials from the very big powers that I think ultimately have responsibility for developing this code of conduct.
Thank you so much. Fedor, over to you. Very good question. Global history knows the attempts to work out such code of conduct, the agreements and treaties which would ensure global and regional security after the world wars. After the First World War, there was a failed attempt to create such a system. We remember the League of Nations after the Second World War, the Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam conference allowed working out a beautiful document with a chapter of the UN. Right now it's more and more difficult, since the war has a different format. After the Cold War, we didn't work out the code of conduct. We didn't work the model of coexistence. For the Western countries, it was a victory in the Cold War, and the strive to expand NATO and to put extra pressure on Russia. Russia proposed twice working out such a code of conduct. In 2008, the agreement on the European security, it was laughed at in Europe. The second was ultimatum to Russia, but it was not ultimatum to Russia. That was the last warning proposal to talk in October 2021, when there were Russian proposals on agreement between Russia, NATO, Russia, and the United States, and there was an attempt to work out the mode of coexistence. What it led to, we all know. I want to hope that the diplomatic end to the conflict when it is possible, and when Kiev regime doesn't put obstacles, and those who support this regime will not set obstacles to ending this severe conflict in diplomatic manner, it may become the underlying foundation for discussing a new model of security, which should be inclusive, the coexistence principle-based diplomacy. But is everyone ready to that? Will everyone strive for that? This is an open question. So far, we don't see this readiness in Europe. I'm not talking even about the Kiev regime, because this continued conflict is the way to exist whenever conflict is over. So there is a question whether elections should be conducted, and the election to rather, otherwise the authorities are not going to be legitimate anymore. Dear colleagues, questions from the audience, but all the panelists want to answer these questions. As Thomas said, is that he doesn't participate in the policy, but one person is in politics right now. Alexander, over to you. I do participate in diplomacy, which defines politics. Thank you. Very, very good question. I've listened to what Thomas Graham, competitive coexistence and code of conduct, and it got me back to this peaceful existence, because competitive existence is a peaceful existence, coexistence, and the code of conduct is one of the major documents by OECD, which the West is trying to forget. Why? Because it stipulates indivisible security, the major principle which should be followed in the region of OECD. It's indivisible security. Nobody uses and tries to benefit from your own security at the cost of other security. No single state, no single alliance considers the region of OECD as the area of its own responsibility. I can quote a lot this OECD document, which actually was worked out and which actually stipulated this collective coexistence. Where is OECD right now? There is no security, there is no cooperation actually, but the result, the outcome of the current state of affairs is not the lack of norms or rules which we have abandoned and which are right in its own way. And if they had been fulfilled, we would be living in a different world, in Europe, globally, because we see the Charter of the UN. Let's look who can work out something better than the Charter UN. The question is about the enforcement and compliance with the Charter and the readiness of the state to live and follow the rules, not the rules created by the West, by the rules which exist, which are international law, and to be based on the fact that international law is a guarantor of security, prosperity, equality, progress, and so many other things. Getting back to OECD. I remember 1999, the 23rd of March, when there was Solana executing the OECD country without any consent of this organization. I'd like to thank Mr. Vatalovsky that he remembers the proposals by the Russian Federation in 2021. That was not the ultimatum. If we look at all the elements of the Russian proposal, if they had been complied with, they would improve the quality of the security situation in Europe and Euro-Atlantic region. It's difficult to argue with that. It's difficult to question that. If we ask any person in the street who hasn't lost his sanity, and we would ask, would it improve the security? And he would say, yes, of course, undoubtedly. And this crisis wouldn't have emerged. But the answer we got from NATO on one of the key clauses of this document, that NATO would not expand eastward. So the answer was quite clear. Russia has no veto right. How does it fit into this indivisible security principle? It doesn't. So this is the dilemma we faced. And getting back to this question, I do believe that these are not political processes which should lead us to something. You know, in the Eurasian concept, which we promote and which has more and more proponents, and we see bigger interest in that. So these principles we have been fighting for, and which manifested in other documents, and I have given the list of these documents, they are being actually implemented in division security, non-interference, regional security, and responsibility for the security in your regional, so-called regional ownership. So this is happening. A new character of relations is being shaped within SCO and BRICS. It's quite clear what is happening. It's not about the common ground and new centers of attraction within these new polarization processes, but these organizations which have huge potential to mitigate conflicts, and the objective of these organizations is to avoid conflicts among the member states. I'd like to wrap it up. I do believe that to ensure global discussion of these problems is only possible when the political elites in the West change. I'm absolutely positive about that. Today, we celebrate the anniversary of de Gaulle to the USSR. He stayed here for 11 days. He went on the 20th of June. He attended Moscow and Volgograd, and he proposed an idea, the security of Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic, and he said that the security of Europe cannot be not only against but without security of Russia, the Soviet Union back then. Only together, when such people come to power, then we can start thinking about our movement forward to shape these rules.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned the OEC, so let me pass the floor to Thomas Greninger once again. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And let me just tell the translator that there is a difference between the OECD and the OECE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But let me make a more fundamental point. First, I very much like this idea of competitive coexistence, and I would agree with you, Alexander, that it's in a way, it sounds very similar, like peaceful coexistence 2.0. So now codes of conduct. I think that makes a lot of sense, but you would need them on different levels. You would need them bilaterally between Russia and the United States. You probably would also need them between the United States and China. And I'm sure, you have in your strategic partnership between Russia and China, you have something like a code of conduct. But then you probably also want to widen the circle and have something like a code of conduct in a G format. I mean, you have mentioned the G20. Perhaps the G20 is a bit big, but then who would you exclude? And then finally, you also need to have these kinds of discussion in an inclusive setting. And this takes you to the code of conduct of the OEC. And let me tell you, I was very frustrated during my time in the OEC that the great powers, Russia, United States, did not pay more attention to the code of conduct. And so let us have a look at this document again. Let us modernize it, reinvigorate it. I think that would be the inclusive part. So bilateral, minilateral, and inclusive multilateral approaches to it. And let me end by agreeing with Tom Graham. I think these kinds of discussions right now on governmental level are just simply not possible. So let's use informal spaces, and I can reassure you that my center works on a code of conduct, and I think it's very important, very fascinating, and I hope at some point then insights gained on an informal level among leading think tanks can be brought up into governmental negotiations.
Спасибо. Я обещал вопросы из зала. Пожалуйста.
I promised to get some questions from the floor. Should you have any questions, raise your hand. I don't see any hand raised. And, well, it only leaves me to thank our panelists. In my opinion, it was a very informative panel with no propaganda and empty talks. Everyone was sticking to their positions, which, in my opinion, offers an added value to such international meetings. I appreciate all your contributions. I think there is a question from the floor.
I have a question for both the Thomases, if I may. Thomas, you did mention the G20 and that the US should lead the new rules around the competitive coexistence, but we have the opportunity. The US is the president of the G20, and so far there's not been a single meeting that discusses this. And for you, Thomas, you talk a lot about the middle powers. Well, the world has a bulge, is in a bulge of middle powers, but they don't seem to have the confidence to start talking about it. And how can they keep looking to Europe and the West to give them some confidence. How can we encourage that?
Well, we have no time, absolutely, so please, as short as possible.
I don't make U.S. policy at this point, is the quickest answer to that. And I'm not talking about what the current administration is doing. I'm talking about, respectively, how the United States should conduct itself. And that is a debate that we're having in the United States right now.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there is a group of countries that, you know, is very concerned about great power behavior these days. And they are in a process of discovering, you know, their strategic autonomy and are trying to widen their strategic autonomy. But it's still, you know, a far way to getting properly organized to create new alliances among them to really then also be able to define policies. But I think I'm pretty sure that we will see that in the years to come. And, you know, the worse the behavior of great powers, the more incentives for middle powers to get organized, to get their act together. And, you know, and I'll conclude on this, 50 years ago, the Helsinki process was driven by a group of countries that then were called the NNN, the neutrals and the non-aligned. Today, you would probably call them middle powers. And great powers tolerated the process initially. At some point, they felt, well, it's not that bad, you know, and started owning it. But the process as such was driven by, you know, what today you would call a group of middle powers and perhaps even small states.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Kripalani interrupted me in the middle of my sentence. I wanted to say that Yevgeny Primakov was a big master of such discussions, and I do think that he would celebrate what he could have heard. Thank you so much.